Izhak Englard is the Bora Laskin Professor Emeritus of Law at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. He received his PhD at the Faculty of Law, at the Faculty of Law at the University of Paris in 1966. His academic career, or most of it, was at the Faculty of Law at the Hebrew University. He was a visiting professor and lecturer at many universities all over the world: Rome, USC Los Angeles, Yale Law School, Zurich, Grenoble, UPenn, Humboldt, Columbia, and I'm sure that I'm missing a few. Something that is quite notable, from 1997 until his retirement in 2003, he served as Justice of the Israel Supreme Court. He's the author of many books and articles on tort law, family law, unjust enrichment, jurisprudence, Jewish law, state and religion, comparative law. Professor Englard is a member of the Israel Academy of Sciences. He is a titular member of the International Academy of Comparative Law. He was awarded the Israel Prize in Law in 1997. He received the Doctor Honoris Causa from the Julius Maximilians University in Würzburg. Please.
Thank you. The basic question is whether there is a contradiction between the two notions, Judaism and democracy. It seems that in the eyes of the Israeli legislator, there is no question. As a matter of fact, in two basic laws, which are of constitutional validity, it is written, and I quote, "The purpose of this basic law is to protect human dignity and liberty, or respectively the freedom of occupation," another law, "in order to establish in a basic law the values of the State of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state." The same idea appears in a series of regular laws. It appears, therefore, that the legislator takes it for granted that Judaism and democracy go hand in hand. However, there is a catch in this assumption. The fact that the legislator uses two adjectives, Jewish and democratic, is at least an indication that the two notions are not identical. From a formal point of view, it signifies, on the one hand, that a fully democratic state is not necessarily a Jewish state, a very reasonable conclusion, and on the other hand, that a purely Jewish state is not necessarily a democratic one. The latter possibility constitutes the issue of this lecture. What is the exact relationship between the nature of a Jewish state and the nature of democracy? The answer depends obviously on the substance of these notions, which are, however, based upon controversial values. Let us assume, in the framework of this lecture, that democracy signifies a liberal and secular democracy, whose political system relies upon majority vote, but protects the fundamental rights such as personal freedom and equality. The determination of the notion Judaism is considerably more complex in view of the fundamental dissension inside contemporary Judaism itself. In very general and rough outlines, a secular national conception of Judaism clashes with a religious normative outlook. I'm of the opinion that the clarification of the historical ideological background of the conflict is essential for a deeper understanding of the actual problem. In my lecture, I will concentrate on the problem from the perspective of the historical religious Judaism. Another not less important problem concerns the tension between democracy and nation-state, which is based upon a specific ethnic group. This is especially relevant in a state where there are ethnic minorities. However, I will have to exclude this problem in view of time restraint. In the center of my examination are the conceptions of three outstanding Jewish thinkers, Maimonides, Baruch Spinoza, and Moses Mendelssohn. On the face of it, it may appear strange to refer to these historical figures, but they are still of the greatest actual relevance in relation to the contemporary controversy about the essence of a Jewish state, and that for two reasons. Each of these three philosophers dedicated one of his major works to the problem of the relationship between state and religion in Judaism. And second, the ideas of these thinkers, of the three thinkers, exercise a decisive influence upon the political theory and practice in present-day Israel. I will begin with Maimonides, 1138 to 1204, the great philosopher and rabbinic scholar of the 12th century. Maimonides is one of the very few rabbis who not only developed a comprehensive political philosophy in his work, The Guide of the Perplexed, with a special reference to the specific function of a Jewish state, but in addition determined the legal framework of that state in his codificatory halachic work, the Mishneh Torah. True, later generations of rabbis, influenced by the preeminent tendency of mysticism, looked upon his philosophical work with great skepticism and rejected his fundamental rationalism, the mystic. However, the halachic work of Maimonides retained until today its undiminished great authority. Moreover, his rational philosophy acquired renewed esteem in the time of the Jewish Enlightenment, 18th, 19th century, the Haskalah. On its part, the latter influenced the neo-orthodoxy which started at the turn of the previous century. Now, the political philosophy of Maimonides is basically influenced by Plato. The human being is a social animal which can acquire perfection only in association with others. The political community doesn't stand in opposition to the individual. On the contrary, the individual constitutes an organic part of the collectivity. The latter, represented by means of the political authority, has to care for the individual's corporal and spiritual well-being. According to Maimonides, there exists a fundamental difference between the ordinary legislation of the general states and that of the Jewish state. The latter rests upon the divinely determined law, the Torah, established by Moses, the perfect human being, the ideal prophet legislator. The ordinary state legislations relate exclusively to the corporal perfection of man, which concerns, according to Maimonides, three of the four possible human perfections, namely property, material wealth, corporal beauty and strength, and moral virtue. Solely the Torah legislation is able to conduce the human being to the fourth and highest perfection, the intellectual virtue. This perfection is the ultimate purpose of the human existence, since it enables the cognition of the divine matters. It constitutes the philosophical perception of the world and thereby of divinity. Hence, it follows that only the Jewish state, which is based upon the teaching of Moses, can conduce the individual to perfection. Evidently, each only according to his individual spiritual capacity. He was a realist, Maimonides. He knew that not everybody can reach the highest stage of perfection. Therefore, the task and the mission of the Jewish state are to care that its citizens observe the religious precepts, since they are the only means to reach corporal and spiritual perfection. The ideal Jewish state is therefore the polis, the integrated city-state, where all citizens pursue a common aim, namely the perception of divine matters to achieve by means of the implementation of the Torah precepts. The conception of the essence and function of the Jewish state is still the dominant one in the contemporary Orthodox Judaism. It stands in blatant contrast to modern conception of a liberal and secular state in general, and to the reality of the State of Israel in particular. It puts the believing Orthodox Jew before an immense dilemma. How should he relate towards the non-ideal reality of a liberal, modern Jewish state which acts according to democratic principles? As a matter of fact, the modern understanding of statehood differs fundamentally from the ancient notion of polis. The function of the modern liberal state limits itself to what in Maimonides' views are the two lowest corporal perfections, namely property and corporal welfare. The liberal state doesn't claim to employ public means for the achievement by the individual of specific moral or intellectual perfections. It confines itself to create the external frame conditions for the individual in order to enable him or her to pursue their own ideas of happiness. The psychological dilemma of many Orthodox Jews got even more acute by the fact that they accept in principle the prerequisites of modern democracy. So it's an internal problem also. Now to the actual reaction of the Orthodoxy to the reality of the State of Israel. It goes from its total rejection and demonization, as declared as Satan's deed, to the conception of its being the positive fulfillment of messianic hope. The great majority of Orthodox citizens consider themselves still bound by the traditional conception of the ideal religious state according to the model of Maimonides. Hence, their constant efforts to implement religious precepts democratically by means of state law, especially in the public domain. Baruch Spinoza, 1632, I'm now going to the second one, to 1677, intended in his theological political treatise, written in Latin, to develop an antithesis to the Maimonidean conception. He knew very well Maimonides. Spinoza probably had also some mystical knowledges. As a matter of fact, the political philosophy of Spinoza is based upon an alternative secular understanding of Judaism. The starting point is of great philosophical interest for contemporary Jewish thought. In his treatise, Spinoza makes a curious and rather surprising statement on the re-establishment of a Jewish state, and I quote in English, "Nay, I would go so far as to believe that if the foundations of the Jews' religion have not emasculated their minds, they even may, if occasion offers, so changeable are human affairs, raise up their empire afresh, and that God may a second time elect them." He used here for emasculate, he said effaminare, which is politically probably not a very correct word. And the scientists found that he took it from Italian philosopher who dealt with the problem. So he knew also. The words of Spinoza sounded in the ears of the founding fathers of Zionism like a prophecy. The ideological importance of this passage for the political and mainly secular movement can be easily understood after its decoding in the light of Spinoza's philosophy. It contains three fundamental elements. First, some of the foundations of traditional Jewish religion have to be overcome in order to re-establish a Jewish state. He said, if the religion has not emasculated their minds. What did he intend? Spinoza didn't reveal his nature of these impeding, mind-emasculating tenets. But I presume, and I had a discussion with Altman in Boston about it, and he agreed with me, that he referred to the passive attitude of Jewish orthodoxy in awaiting the coming of Messiah. Without active human intervention, there are no political events. This brings us to the second connected element. Spinoza denies the eschatological nature of events. There is no historia sacra, but there are exclusively historical events. For this reason, the Jewish people cannot wait for a divine intervention. It has to enter human history and apply political means in order to bring about the re-establishment of a state, which constitutes a historical possibility. Human activity is not only legitimate, but also necessary. The third element concerns the idea of God's renewed election of the Jewish people. In Spinoza's language, where God signifies nature, Deus sive natura, the election of a people, in his own concept, of any people, in his view, every people is elected, the establishment and preservation of specific national characteristics that distinguish one people from all other, like, he takes an example, the pigtail of the Chinese, which he thinks makes them specific, elected by divinity, which means elected by nature. The mainstream of modern political Zionism, which eventually led to the establishment of the State of Israel, was in fact guided by the idea of a national secular state that thus adhering to the premises of Spinoza. The establishment of the state is a historical event which requires political and military activities. The characteristic qualities of a Jewish state are of a national cultural dimension, at the center of which stands the Hebrew language. In Spinoza's view, the function of religion is to inculcate obedience to the government and to the laws of the state. Hence, religion should be put into the service of the democratic secular state by using it to further people's loyalty towards the political authorities. The third Jewish thinker who dealt with the relationship with faith and religion is Moses Mendelssohn, 1729 to 1786. Though in his treatise Jerusalem of 1783, he doesn't explicitly mention Spinoza, the ideas of the latter have nevertheless considerably influenced the treatise. Mendelssohn deeply disagreed with Spinoza's negative view on the nature of Judaism, but accepts a number of the latter's propositions for opposite purposes. Thus, Maimonides accepts the thesis that the Torah constitutes a political constitution, but he insists on its religious significance as being aimed at the ultimate end of religion, the felicity of the soul. Mendelssohn rejects Spinoza's thesis of religion's subordination to the interests of the state, as well as John Locke's idea of the strict separation between state and religion. In his view, the common welfare of society comprises spiritual as well as temporal concerns which are inseparable. The task of society includes the education of the individual. But he demands, Mendelssohn, complete freedom of religion in relation to the state, and going beyond Locke, he insists on freedom from all kinds of coercion, even inside the church. Mendelssohn is against excommunication and exclusion from religious community. He is against, as I said, coercion, and he bases this idea that coercion is forbidden on the history of Judaism. And he said, state and religion in his original constitution were not united but identical. That's why it was permitted to use coercion in Mosaic times and later. But later, he says, but later it should be prohibited. Coercion should be prohibited. He explains that the Mosaic constitution existed only once. And he says, I quote, "It has disappeared, and only the Almighty knows at what people and in which century something similar may appear again." He was against the possibility of a restoration of a Jewish state. I don't want to go into it. Somebody suggested to him, and he said it's impossible today. He said the nomination of a bodily king in the time of Prophet Samuel undermined the original constitution. State and religion were no longer the same. Religious offenses are no longer a crime against the state, which was at the past, and that's why it should be completely prohibited coercion in any religious context. He himself had no illusion about that his notion will be accepted by the Orthodoxy. He himself wrote in one of his letters to Herz Homberger, "My notions about Judaism can, in fact, satisfy neither the Orthodox nor the heterodox. I took it for granted, therefore, that I would find most opinions opposed to me." That means his opposition was by also Jacobi. He was attacked. How can you say that Judaism is against coercion if it's full of coercion in the religious context? However, Mendelssohn's oeuvre was most influential in Reform and conservative Judaism. Now let us return to the topic of the lecture. Is there a contradiction between Judaism and liberal democracy? The answer lies in the different conceptions of Judaism. Even if we disregard the mentioned negative outlook upon the very reality of a Jewish state by the extreme ultra-Orthodox minority, rabbinical Judaism, based upon the Maimonidean premises of the essence and function of the Jewish state, clashes with the conception of liberal democracy. The fundamental contrast concerns the basic norm of a normative system, namely the source of its validity. Divine precepts versus human majority laws. According to the religious conception, in case of a normative conflict, the religious norms enjoy absolute priority. Hence, the religious outlook clashes with the democratic majority rule. A few actual examples relating to fundamental human rights and to the principle of equality demonstrate the practical consequences of that conflict. The discrimination according to rabbinic law of Gentiles and of women, the violation of freedom of religion and from religions by the halachically permitted coercive imposition of religious prohibitions and commandments upon non-believers, the political problem of the fate of the occupied territories in the Holy Land. Only to give you some examples of the contrast and, I would say, the conflict between the religious outlook. As a result, many adherents of the secular outlook, such as the late Professor Victor Leontine, claim that the very combination of rabbinic Judaism and democracy is a contradictio in adjecto, a contradiction in terms. Hans Kelsen described the fundamental contrast between religion and democracy in his work Vom Wesen und Wert der Demokratie, the essence and value of democracy. In his conception, democracy is based upon the assumption that there are no absolute values. Values are merely relative, and therefore one has to respect the minority views in order to enable them to conquer the majority. Kelsen admits that the impossibility to determine absolute values is a tragic dimension of mankind and therefore of democracy. He knew it's a tragic thing, but we cannot change it. Religion on its part starts from the opposite assumption. It postulates the knowledge of absolute truth through divine revelation. As a result, if democracy rests on the assumption of relativity, it is incompatible with religion, which presupposes the possession of absolute values. Where the absolute truth is known, there is no place for divergent values. Maybe they may be of a majority or of a minority. In view of this contradiction between rabbinical Judaism and democracy, how can the intention of the Israeli legislator who combined the two notions be implemented? Here we find that some jurists, among them Victor Leontine, adopt the idea of Spinoza by identifying Judaism not with religion, but with national secular culture. As mentioned, this was the conception of secular Zionism. Accordingly, Judaism relates to the Hebrew language and literature, as well as to common social behavioral patterns. Seen from these premises, there is no conflict between democracy and as a political system and Judaism as a promotion of the emerging Hebrew culture. Other jurists conceive the solution of the conflict by means of giving absolute priority to the notion of liberal democracy. Judaism comes into operation only when it doesn't derogate any aspect of the liberal democracy. Some others view the significance of the two notions within the framework of human rights. The state recognizes all human rights which result from the notion of democracy. It adds those human rights which arise from the specific Jewish tradition. President Aaron Barak had a special version for the solution of the problem. Judaism, in the sense of the basic laws, comprises only the universal values of the Jewish tradition. In case of a value conflict between the two notions, it has to be resolved according to the conception of the enlightened public. Other scholars who are more concerned with the deep division inside the Jewish community recommend a cautious balancing between the different moral concepts. Some would consign the task to the justices of the Supreme Court, others would prefer the Knesset as being part of the democratic process. Mendelssohn's interpretation of Judaism constitutes an additional way to overcome the problematic situation. Since any coercion is excluded from the religious point of view, no legislative violation of human rights can occur. This way is conform to the outlook of Reform Judaism, which requires absolute autonomy on the part of the individual and bases the religious duties upon universal ethical values. However, this conception is hardly compatible with the orthodox notions of mutual liability in relation to the observance of religious commandments and the threat of divine sanctions imposed upon the whole community, which is a leitmotif in the biblical and Jewish tradition. According to my personal view, and I come to the end of my lecture, the existence of a modern Jewish state constitutes, in fact, a tremendous challenge to rabbinical Judaism. The certainly non-ideal, according to Judaism, liberal state confronts the rabbinical tradition with completely new problem. The traditional, ideological and legal equipment is not sufficient to provide the observant Orthodox Jew who views the actual Jewish state as a positive reality with satisfactory solutions for the relationship between state and religion. This person is conscious of the conflict, but is not prepared to deny the legitimacy of the state. He strives to accommodate the democratic foundations of the state with the halakha, the rabbinical legal tradition. A possible solution would be a differentiation between the public sphere and the private one. In the first, a symbolic maintenance of Jewish values like Sabbath rest. In the private sphere, no coercion. This solution was actually practiced during decades by means of a so-called status quo. However, in recent times, this compromise manifests deep cracks. In my view, the coexistence between observant and non-observant people requires a pragmatic course of action, or more precisely, a complementary understanding of the inherent contradictions in the sense of the theory of Niels Bohr, the great Danish physicist and Nobel Prize winner. The human existence is replete with internal contradictions, as well as a physical reality, at least seen from an epistemological standpoint. These contradictions cannot be resolved by a denial of the validity of the opposite values. The final resolution of all contradictions is possible only in the redeemed world at the end of times. Until then, in the present historical time, a striving towards harmonious coexistence of contradictions must suffice. No doubt, this presents a difficult and painful process, like the combination which Bohr was talking about when he was talking about the complementarity, the combination of love and justice. He was asking, how can you combine? He was asking Bohr in one of his articles, I have to punish my son when he made an offense. How can I punish him if I love him? So he said that's a part of the complementarity you have to combine, like in the physics, in the physical world, where wave and real things will have to be combined. And moreover, strict law and compassion. Rabbinical Judaism must find a way to cope with modernity, and especially with the reality of a modern Jewish state, which recognizes and respects the democratic principle and whose population is to a great part composed of non-believers. On the other hand, the secular circles must deal with Judaism as a religious notion and with the pursuits and ambition of the Orthodox citizens. The Jewish state constitutes a challenge for the whole Jewish people, believers and non-believers, and who knows, maybe part of the world waits for our answer. Thank you.